Welcome to Liberty in America, Past, Present, and Future with Dr. Bill Chobe. Doc is a historian and a reenactor. On this show, you'll hear his thoughts about our personal liberties from their earliest recorded beginnings. You'll also be transported back to the 1750s to relive the life of Colonel George Washington and his adventures during the French and Indian War. Let's get started. Here's Dr. Bill Chobe.
Okay, here we go again. Dr. Bill Chobe, Liberty in America, Past, Present, Future. This is another one of the series that we're doing on this topic. Today we're going to talk about the founding of the Republic. Now, mind you that we talked in the past about the French and Indian War and the debt that was accrued by the English and the French and how this had an effect on the colonists. But the beginning of what we can call our Republic goes back much further than that. Well, mind you, in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, there's a lot of persecution going on, not only from the political leaders, but also from the organized religions of Catholicism, Anglicanism, and Protestantism in general. You basically had to toe the line to their way of viewing how the Bible interpreted Christianity for them. And the Catholics in Spain were burning the heretics at the stake or leaving them imprisoned to languish until death or while they were stealing their property. And that, of course, we remember that had much to do with the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. But as we move forward into the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, there are different groups by this time had enough knowledge of the Holy Scriptures that they decided upon themselves that organized religion was not necessarily what they wanted to believe. Now, while the Inquisition was going on in the northern parts of Europe, the organized religions of Anglicanism or Protestant were also persecuting, and they were hanging people instead of burning them. They called them witches and warlocks, and that was justification for it. It's basically the same thing. It was the arbitrary power of rule over people led to when might was right. They were in bondage, so people wanted to break out of that, and they used the Bible as a basis to do that. They were persecuted, and one little group eventually left England and went to the Netherlands, to where they formed their little groups, and they were content for a while there, but then they started to be persecuted again, and finally they petitioned the King of England to give them a charter in the New World. So that little group took off in August of 1620 and began to make their way to what they felt was a charter in the colony of Virginia. Mind you that there was a previous colony there in 1603. It was pretty much considered to be the end of the world. Let's get rid of these malcontents and miscreants by sending them off to somewhere where they won't be bothering us anymore. So off they went in their little ship, the Mayflower. And on their way across the Northern Atlantic, they encountered severe storms that threw them way off course. And after 3 months at sea, you can imagine the cost of these 102 explorers, both men and women and children. Many died along the way. But they ended up and they found themselves off the shore of Cape Cod, what we now call Massachusetts. Now, at this point, the charter that they had for Virginia was worthless. So they had to find a way to how they were going to organize their body politic, if you will. And being that they realized they're on their own and they're free to make whatever agreement they want between them, they came up with the Mayflower Compact. Now, this is really important because, and I'm going to read this to you, because this set for the first time in recorded history, a free people being totally uncontrolled by any external forces except the severity of nature, chose to come together to create their own laws. And this is, let me read it to you here, just to get a sense of what was going on in their minds. This is 1620, mind you. Having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together in a civic body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just law and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. There it is, the first rule of law by consent of the governed. Well, as I explained in our last session, that colony attempted to put together a social community, and they had a communal type of living, thinking that they were following what happened with the Acts of the Apostles. Well, that didn't work out too well, because even though they were in this foreign land where the Algonquin Indians had prepared it and harvested their crops there, they remember the Algonquins were scared of it now that smallpox went through there, and they thought the land was cursed. So they had prepared it for this colony to assume it without having to cut the trees and remove the stumps. But that first year, this communal garden, of course, failed to provide enough food for everybody. So the following year, the governor there said, "Look, everybody gets 10 acres of land. Go off and take care of yourself." And they were so successful that they had a bounty, they had a surplus, and from that they had their first Thanksgiving, inviting the Indians and others. But it was because of basically socialism failing and capitalism working that saved them that day. But the Mayflower Compact, very, very important for laying a foundation of thought in the minds of people of how they're going to organize, being so many months away from the shores of Europe and the control of the kings and the organized religions, that the idea caught hold. And later on, there was many of the concept of the consent of the governed. So as we said before, later on in the 18th century, when we had the French and Indian War, the debts that were accrued by that French and Indian War nearly doubled that of the crown. They were up now to 132 million pounds. And the French, of course, likewise had this huge debt. And the French decided to lay that debt upon the rich people. But King George and the Parliament thought that, well, they defended America from the French and the Indians, and therefore the Americans, colonists, owe them something. And in return, they put taxes upon them, expecting them to pay their fair share, if you will. Well, this was not very well received by the people who in the colonies, the 3 million people or so, that were eking out a living, facing the hardships of nature and the many different languages and styles from all the different people that emigrated there. So it was a harsh kind of living, and the old Yankee Scrabble was sort of formed at that time. And with the administration of taxes upon them, many of which were initially received, but then later became to be so much that was overburdening that the resistance started to grow. Sons of Liberty were formed. Sam Adams, whose father was a minister, was bankrupted by the taxes and the government. Was one of the reasons why Sam was such an ardent supporter of freedom. His father, being a minister, had a brewery, and I think today's Sam Adams Brewery is named after that of sorts. But it's what set Sam on a lifelong resistance to the crown. Now, the soldiers were in Boston, and they were patrolling around, and they would be jeered and snowballs thrown at them and stuff like that on a regular basis. But one particular day, they were in March of 1770. A contingency was rather being hit pretty hard with snowballs and stones and bricks and stuff. Some of it was in response to an unfortunate death of a young boy who was part of a jeering crowd that eventually got shot. But this crowd, unruly crowd, kept backing the soldiers up against the wall. And then finally, one of the soldiers slipped and fell. His gun went off, and then the word was given out to fire. And a volley was unleashed into this unruly crowd. And at the front of that was a man named Crispus Attucks. He was one of the first to fall. And he was an African-American, a free African-American. So this incident became known as the Boston Massacre, although it really wasn't a massacre. But Sam Adams and his buddy Paul Revere wanted to use this for a propaganda tool to really stoke the fires of resistance to the Brits. And Paul Revere, being a silversmith and a dentist of sorts, put together a silver plate that was later used to print the now famous picture of the Boston Massacre, as he called it. And printed copies of this were released all over the colonies, and it got people mad, as propaganda will. But the soldiers, when brought to trial, they were defended by a famous Boston attorney, John Adams, who we will see later on, turned against the Brits. But he defended these soldiers successfully, saying that it was an act of self-defense and therefore wasn't just open hostility. So the soldiers were released and found to be innocent because of John Adams. But I'm sure that really hurt his practice. But he was a brilliant lawyer, and he brought the facts to bear. And I believe it was he that said, facts are stubborn figures. We may hear repeated, sometime today. But this resistance with the Sons of Liberty and the agitations that continued on, got to a point to whenever the tea tax was levied, and the tea tax was more than just tea. It had to do with playing cards or any legal documents, and just the dice that the soldiers used. It was on everything. So they said enough is enough, and whenever a shipload of tea came in on a British ship, because the Brits had a monopoly on the tea, nobody else could bring it in there. They had to buy their tea, and of course the price they chose. This is that might versus right kind of thing. So the colonists, the resistance, the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Indians, and they jumped on the boat and threw all the tea into the harbor. And this act was would be known as the Boston Tea Party. But there was also similar tea parties in New York City, in Annapolis, and Philadelphia, and even in Charleston, South Carolina. So it was a popular way to show their displeasure with the tea tax. So as all of this was going on, the 12 of the 13 colonies had representatives that got together, and they met in Philadelphia in 1774, and they convened the First Continental Congress. And out of this became the Articles of Confederation that was the precept to eventually what became our Constitution. And incidentally, in the Articles of Confederation, there's a clause that says that they are perpetually bound together. And this becomes important later on when Abraham Lincoln is saying that the South could not succeed because the original contract with the colonies was for perpetual membership. So they went on with many more taxes and many more acts and back and forth, and take 3 months to get an answer from whenever they objected to this or that. And that certainly didn't make it easier. I'm sure if they had mass communication as we had today, much of what would have happened would have been avoided. But the colonists, as their rage continued, it was not infrequently to get the local tax collector, and they would tar and feather him and run him through town, or they'd hang him, dummies up in effigy and burn them and things like that. And even to the point of burning the homes of the tax collectors down if they were considered to be agents of the crown. It got to be pretty nasty. I mean, it finally came to a point where the colonists, they had their armory of sorts in Concord, in Massachusetts, and the Brits wanted to get a hold of that because they figured they needed to disarm the countrymen, or there was going to be trouble. Well, then what happened that night, and as the colonists prepared for all of this was commemorated by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And you may remember this poem from when you were in school. Of course, I did. I don't know if they're teaching today, but it goes as such. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive that remembers that famous date and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. One if by land, two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore shall be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm for the country folks to be up and to arm. Well, that's what they did. And the Brits, they landed over there, went across the Charles River, and they landed and they started their march towards Concord. And they came to the next morning on April 19th. Today we call it Patriots Day, by the way. They encountered a number of the Minutemen, who called themselves Minutemen because they were ready to grab their rifles at a minute, and everybody had a rifle on a farm. And they stood out in front of the church at Lexington Green in Lexington, Massachusetts. And as they lined up and the soldiers came, the officers who was riding back and forth, and he was obviously very unhappy, expected not to be opposed as they went to Concord. And he shouted out to them, "Lay down your arms, you damn rebels, or you're all dead men." And they waited a little bit for a response, and they didn't lay down their arms. So he said, "Fire." And the soldiers unleashed a volley into the brave men. And with that, the men retreated, sniping at them on the way. And they were running out of paper wads for their muskets. And the pastor of the church came out with a Watts hymnal. Watts was the common hymnal that they had at these churches, and he would tear out pages of Watts' hymnal and give them to him. And he says, "Give them Watts, boys." And so they took that as wadding, and off they went. And as they retreated and retracted, the British soldiers made their way to Concord. Now at Concord, they had to cross a bridge before they could get to the armory. And there was this again was commemorated by a famous American poet, and I got to tell you, I've been at both of these places, and this little bridge was interesting. The NRA has a statue of the embattled farmer, but Emerson said, "By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard around the world." And that's where they stopped them. Now, that bridge is not that wide. Maybe you can 2 or 3 men abreast could go across at the time. The little creek wasn't that big, but it was flooded at the time. It was April. And on the English side of that bridge, there's 2 graves. And the 2 graves of the first British soldiers that were killed there, and they were 16 years old. So you can imagine at what age they were brought here as British soldiers. But that's what it was at the time. So as the Brits withdrew towards to Boston, they were being sniped at left and right from behind every rock and tree, and really guerrilla warfare as we know it. And they paid a heavy price on their way back. And of course, by the time they got back into the safety of Boston, it was a whole other story about what was going to happen next. But that word of what that incident at Lexington Green found its way all over the colonies. And even though there was, back in 1770 to 75, it did take a while to get out there. But by the following month in May, there was a little group in western Pennsylvania at Hannistown, which was a little town that George Washington had cut out on the way to evicting the French from Fort Duquesne. And that Hannistown, they got together and they decided they were going to say something about it. And they developed what was called the Hannistown Resolve on May 16th of 75. Incidentally, if you read that, the Hannistown Resolve, you'll see that there's some language in there that'll you're going to become familiar with a little later. Following that, the following week in Mecklenburg, North Carolina, on May 20th, they came up with the Mecklenburg Resolution. So you can see this was the resistance here was growing, and it was widespread. Eventually, every town and little county and state and city, they had their own feelings about this, and they'd write it down in these little declarations. So as the people were more and more upset about it, they didn't really have a common calling, except that, well, they're, the Brits and the king, they're the most powerful army in the world, a bunch of bad guys. We don't like what they're doing, and they hurt our guys. And what are we going to do about it? But they didn't have a moral foundation from which to put their lives on the line. So there was a lot of the support for the freedom and the liberty. It came from the pulpit, but it wasn't unifying until as the local governments got together, state colony governments got together. There was some firebrands out there, and one of which was Patrick Henry in the Virginia House of Burgesses in March. This is prior to the incident at Lexington, but he said that there's no longer room for hope. And I quote him, please. There is no longer room for hope. If we wish to be free, we must fight, and appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that we have left to us. They tell me we are weak, but we shall gather strength by resolution. 3 million people armed in the holy cause of liberty in such a country are invincible by any force which our enemy can send against us. We shall not fight alone. God presides over the destinies of nations, and we will raise up friends for us. The battle is not to the strong alone, it is to the vigilant, the active, and the brave. Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Ah, forbid it, Almighty God. I know what course others may take, but for me, give me liberty or give me death. End of quote. So the sentiments were stirring, but what really galvanized all of them together was penned together by Thomas Paine in Common Sense. Now, Thomas Paine was a 3-time loser over in England. He came here to sort of forget his past, divorce and bankruptcy and things like that. He was more of a ne'er-do-well, but he was a miscreant. And he sat down and he wrote the Common Sense Address to the Inhabitants of America. And on the following subjects of the origin, designs of government in general, and remarks on the English Constitution, of monarchy and hereditary succession, thoughts on the perfect state of American affairs, present state of American affairs, and the present ability of America with the same to, can't read that. Anyhow, so here we have this document. It was printed and scattered, and 1 million copies sold. I mean, this is like more successful than Rush Limbaugh. I mean, he had, 3 million people, and you sell 1 million copies of a pamphlet. That really got around. Everybody got to read it, but that was a galvanizing thing. And in the book, Thomas Paine's book, Common Sense, he sets the foundation of how the comparable situation was with Moses and getting away from the Pharaoh, the Exodus, and all that sort of stuff, and how they leaned upon their faith and how they leaned upon the sovereignty of God as being the source of all justice and liberty and freedom. And so from that, with all this being repeated again and again all over the colonies by the Black Brigade, which all the ministers from the pulpit were basically supporting the same ideas or the same concept, they got everybody riled up to believe that this was a just cause. It was right and proper for them to rebel against the crown. So when they finally got together in Philadelphia again, they wanted to put together a declaration of their intentions to the king, and we call this today the Declaration of Independence. Now, mind you that every town, every county, every city, every state had already had their own form of the Declaration, going back to the Haniston Resolve and the Mecklenburg. And in fact, we call that the American Scripture, if you will, all of what had happened there. There's an excellent book on that, by the way, if you're interested in following up on it, by that title, The American Scripture. So they came around, they had a committee, and on the committee was Ben Franklin, it was John Hay, and Thomas Jefferson. There might have been somebody else, I forget right now, but they looked at Jefferson as being learned, and he was eloquent, and he was younger, and so they said, okay, Tom, you know what's going on here. Why don't you write this up? We're going down to the pub. We're going to talk about this some more. So they left him alone, and he had this little desk that he put on his lap, and he wrote this thing out, and with different modifications and back and forth kind of thing, it became the Declaration as we know it today, the Declaration of Independence. And I'd like to read that for you. Just bear with me. But, now and then we need to read this sort of thing to just remember where our roots really come from. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal stations to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the cases which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to this end, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness, Prudence indeed would dictate that government long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and according all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a desire to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such governments and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And he goes down, he has a whole list of different things that they objected to. But it ended with this. With a firm reliance on the divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. When might is right, we live in bondage. When right is might, we live in freedom. So that became a promise. And I know we're getting a little bit long today, so let me finish that next time with you, and we'll continue on the founding of the Republic. But that's pretty much where it came from. And you can see the character of the Mayflower Compact in the very same language. So I thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope I've given you a little insight of why we are Americans and what we have is so special in the history of the world. And with that, let me end here. Thank you.